Do you realize how important a candle's melt pool really is? If you're just a beginner, the term melt pool might be a little foreign to you, but I think a lot of people in the candle industry treat the melt pool as the ultimate judge of whether a candle is good or not. Well, today I want to offer a different way of thinking. I want to show you that I think the melt pool might be the very reason that your candle is behaving poorly. Hello, I'm Kevin from Armatage Candle Company, and today we're going to talk about melt pools. When you light a candle and that wick is on fire, it starts to melt wax below. And that wax melts and it spreads out to the sides and it starts to go down. And what happens is that liquid wax is drawn up through the wick up to the flame where it combusts. And that's pretty much the basic operation of a candle. Now every melt pool has a different characteristic with how wide it is, how deep it is, and how fast it all gets there. And there's a lot of people that have these criteria around how fast that ought to be and how deep it ought to be and how wide it ought to be. Now the rate of speed which that melt pool develops is dependent on a lot of factors, and most of those are tied to the environment. If you're burning a candle in a really warm room or outside for some reason, the wax temperature is going to be a little warmer, which means it's a little bit closer to its melt point. And the closer it is to its melt point, the less thermal energy it takes to melt the wax. So that melt pool is actually going to form a little faster than if you were in, say, a cold Minnesota winter where the wax is going to be a little bit colder, don't you know? Another thing to think about with the melt pool is that liquid wax contains fragrance oil, and it plays a very large role in how well the hot throw develops. Now the wick is really the central role in hot throw development, but ask anyone in the candle community, you might get different answers for what the most important part of a hot throw is. Now, that's where this little piece of advice that I want to talk about comes into play. It's common in the candle community to say the melt pool should expand in X amount of hours, where X is the same as the diameter of your container. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have a 3-inch diameter container, or 2.5 inches, which is what this one is, and you light the wick, that advice suggests that it should take 2.5 hours, because there's 2.5 inches in the diameter, and that's this measurement here all the way across. 2.5 hours to get to a full melt pool, and then by full melt pool they mean full width. There's liquid all the way wall to wall. I want to caution against this as the only criteria that you use to judge your candle. If you go all the way back to what we said earlier, the melt pool forms in response to the heat at the top of the wick by the flame. And that really means the melt pool is a function of how hot the room is and how hot that flame is. But let's talk about wick sizing for just a brief moment, and then we'll come back to this advice to maybe show why I don't think it's a great piece of advice to follow at first. The only way to know if your wick is properly sized is to test burn your candle from start to finish. The whole thing. 4 hours at a time, start to finish. Now you can do any other type of testing that you think should happen, maybe chaos testing or variance testing, whatever you want to do. But the industry standard is to burn your candle 4 hours at a time all the way until it's at the end of its life. And during those tests, you need to check for all these different criteria. You need to check if your wick is mushrooming, if your container temperature is too hot, if the candle is tunneling, if it's giving off too much black smoke. Check out the link below if you want to see the full list of criteria. The most important one of that is container temperature. One reason that candle makers test all the way down, besides it being the industry standard, is that the characteristics of the candle actually change as you get further down. Up at the top, a lot of the heat created by the flame is dissipated into the air. It goes into there, but as you're farther down in a container, that heat actually gets trapped in the walls of the container, and the general environment where the wick is burning is actually hotter, and that air is moving a little faster, feeding even more oxygen to the flame. So down here, below the 50% mark, if you want to call it that, we're talking higher temperatures. Actually, a much higher risk of you exceeding the container temperature safety threshold when you burn your candle. And now all that is to say that if you're getting a full melt pool at the top of your candle and passing all safety measures, great. But what I've seen from my experience when I talk to others, it actually seems that if you're getting a full melt pool that quickly down here, you're very likely at risk of failing a safety test. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that there isn't some magic number with how long a candle needs to burn before it reaches full melt pool, but I think it varies depending on the candle and contextually where you are in the burn. So let's take it back. The ultimate goal of that advice is to say yes, your wick is properly sized, or no, your wick is too big or too small if your melt pool isn't getting big enough fast enough. And I want to draw everyone back to kind of what our industry lays out as the standards for wick testing. Well, the number one thing is safety. And safety tests have a very specific set of criteria that need to pass. And unfortunately for our patients, it requires us to burn the entire candle all the way down. And there are some shortcuts to trying to figure out what that wick is right, but if you're going to be selling candles, it's best that you have proof that you took that candle that you're selling top to bottom, burned it the whole thing. And the other criteria for wick sizing is performance. You want the candle to smell good, and with how subjective that kind of is, I won't really go into that right now, but if you follow the melt pool advice, 1 hour per inch of diameter, that may be a good starting point for you, but it's a shortcut at best. A true burn test all the way down will reveal whether or not your wick is properly sized, and sometimes you can get a full melt pool all the way down. But I also want to say, don't worry if you don't get a full melt pool. As long as when the candle burns all the way down, it eventually cleans those sides, that's all you can ask for too. And so if the top half of the candle leaves a little on the sides at first, but cleans it in the bottom half of the burn, like that's okay too. But that's candle maker's preference. So design your candles to burn the way that you want. If you want a full melt pool all the way down every single time, as long as you're passing safety tests, great. If you're like me, I like to leave a little on the sides in the first half and then kind of melt it as I go. I actually feel like I get a better hot throw all the way down, but that's relatively subjective too. So I'll leave you with this. Start burn testing all the way down. It takes a long time, but the results you're gonna get are more reliable, they're safe, they're industry standards, you're gonna feel better about them. If you wanna know more about strategies, the specifics behind burn testing, what you really need to pass for safety, what are the industry standards, check out the links below at our blog. If this was helpful, like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you later.